Today, we're unpacking the story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. You've probably heard of it. It's honestly one of the most harrowing survival stories in recorded history. It is just a massive testament to the sheer human will to live when literally every single variable is stacked against you. We're going to walk through exactly how this stranded group managed to survive the impossible. 70 days. I want you to just let that sink in for a second. That is the exact amount of time these passengers were left completely alone in the freezing, unforgiving environment of the Andes Mountains. Just try to imagine being stranded in one of the most hostile places on planet Earth at a crazy high altitude for over 2 months. And you know what's really wild? It's this terrifying reality all of the passengers were given up for dead. While these survivors were in this desperate minute-by-minute fight for their lives out on a glacier, the rest of the world had completely moved on. Search efforts eventually stopped, their families, their countries, the global news, literally everyone believed they were gone.
Right, so let's set the scene of how this disaster actually unfolded. It's October 13, 1972. A chartered aircraft carrying a young rugby team, along with some friends and family, takes off from Mendoza, Argentina at 2:18 p.m., heading over to Chile. It was supposed to be this short, fun trip. Actually, when the plane first hit severe turbulence, the rugby players didn't even take it seriously. They were literally cracking jokes about it. But then, at 3:21 p.m., as the plane descended, the clouds suddenly parted, revealing a massive mountain peak right in front of them. The ground collision alarm starts blaring, the pilots pulled up with maximum power, but the rear of the aircraft clipped the mountain. The plane was torn apart, and the remaining fuselage just slid down a glacier at like 350 kilometers per hour, finally stopping after a 700-meter drop. Boom. They were now stranded at an elevation of 3,570 meters. So immediately, they're hit with these deadly threats. We're talking minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures, intense thirst, and the threat of snow blindness from all those UV rays bouncing off the bright white snow. But man, their ingenuity was incredible. Passengers started repurposing seat cushions into snowshoes and using the wool from the seat covers for insulation. To solve the water crisis, a passenger named Fido Strach came up with this brilliant idea to use a metal sheet from the wreckage to create a solar water melter. He basically concentrated the sun's rays to melt snow right into empty wine bottles. And as for the snow blindness, the entire group of survivors had to share just 3 pairs of sunglasses. But look, all the clever hacks in the world can only do so much against catastrophic injuries and freezing cold. 45 passengers boarded that flight. 33 survived the initial brutal crash. But that first night was just completely unforgiving. 2 young medical students, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino, worked frantically to treat severe wounds. That included a skull fracture suffered by Fernando Parado, who actually fell into a coma. They used luggage, seats, and snow to close off the broken rear of the fuselage to make a makeshift shelter. But despite their desperate efforts, 5 injured passengers didn't make it through that first night. By the next morning, their numbers had already dwindled down to 28. Then comes a psychological blow that is just almost impossible to comprehend. For days, search aircraft had flown overhead, but because the plane's fuselage was white, it blended in perfectly with the snow. 11 days after the crash, a survivor named Roy Harley, who was kind of an electronics buff, managed to improvise an antenna and get a broken transistor radio working. It was this moment of immense hope, right? But since it was a one-way radio, they could only listen. And what they heard was totally crushing. After 142 hours, the official search operation had been officially canceled. Just imagine that sinking feeling, realizing no one is looking for you anymore. Okay, so here is where things get really desperate. They were entirely on their own, and they were starving. This was their entire food supply for dozens of people. 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, some peanuts, dates, and a few bottles of wine. They started rationing immediately, but the portions were unimaginably small. To put that starvation into perspective, Fernando Parado, who had thankfully woken up from his coma, made a single chocolate-covered peanut last for 3 whole days. 1 peanut. Over 72 hours. And at nearly 3,800 meters up, there's absolutely no vegetation and 0 animals to hunt. By day 11, the food was entirely gone. Some people even tried eating the cotton and leather from the aircraft seats, which obviously just made them sick. And this brings us to a heartbreaking biological imperative. They were facing an impossible choice. As Roberto Canessa told the group, "We have to eat, and the only probable things were the dead bodies." It was a deeply, deeply agonizing decision because the deceased were their friends, their classmates, their family members. But with literally no other option to avoid starving to death, they made the incredibly difficult choice to consume the bodies of the fallen to save the living. And just as they made this agonizing choice, the mountain unleashed another horror.
On October 29th, 16 days into the ordeal, a massive avalanche buried the broken fuselage while they slept. It just packed their small shelter with snow, suffocating 8 more people. Fernando Parado desperately used a metal pole to punch a hole up through the snow just to get them some ventilation. They were trapped inside that cramped, suffocating space for days. By the time a second avalanche hit in December, taking 3 more lives, the survivors were crushed down to just 16 people.
Knowing they had to save themselves, a small group started exploring the area. On day 33, they found the tail section of the aircraft a few kilometers to the east. Inside, a two-way radio. This was a massive surge of hope. If they could power it, they could call for help. They even found the aircraft's heavy 24-kilogram batteries in the tail section. But then they hit a fatal mismatch. The aircraft's electrical system required a 115-volt AC current, while those heavy batteries were only 24-volt DC. With no way to convert the power, the radio was utterly useless. Despair set in all over again. Help wasn't coming, they were gonna have to walk out.
Preparing for a massive final expedition without any mountaineering gear meant they had to improvise brilliantly. First up, 18-year-old survivor Carlos Miguel Rodriguez used a sewing kit his mom had given him to meticulously stitch together pieces of insulation, creating a massive sleeping bag big enough for 3 guys. Next, to fight the cold, they layered literally whatever they had. Parado wore 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, and 4 pairs of socks, which, get this, he then wrapped in a plastic shopping bag to keep the moisture out. Pure survival DIY. Finally, Parado, Canessa, and a survivor named Vizintin set off blindly westward, battling thin air and sliding backward with almost every step.
They expected to climb the peak to their west and, see the green valleys of Chile, just on the other side. But on the morning of the 4th day of their hike, they reached the summit. And what they saw was just crushing. 360 degrees of snow-covered peaks. Mountains stretched out perfectly to the horizon in every single direction. Realizing this journey was going to be vastly longer than they thought, Vizintin bravely volunteered to return to the crash site so Parado and Canessa could have his rations. And Vizintin ingeniously used an aircraft seat as a sleigh, sliding down the mountain and making it back in just 1 hour, a trip that had taken them 3 entire days to climb. Leaving just Parado and Canessa to continue. 61 kilometers. That is the staggering distance Fernando Parado and Roberto Canessa hiked on foot without any technical gear, no map, no compass, over the course of 10 grueling days. The physical toll was just beyond extreme. By the time they reached the end of this trek, Canessa had lost half of his body weight, dropping down to a mere 44 kilograms. But finally, after hiking for days, they reach a valley with a roaring river. And across that river, they spot 3 men on horseback. Now, the river was way too loud to yell across, but the very next day, one of those men, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, returned. He tied a piece of paper and a pencil to a stone and chucked it across the rushing water. Parado grabbed it and wrote this desperate message. It started with, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains." He explained that they were Uruguayan, they'd been walking for 10 days, they were starving, and their injured friends were still trapped back at the crash site. Sergio Catalan read the note, tossed him some bread, and then rode on horseback for 10 solid hours to reach the nearest city and alert the army. And that brings us to December 22nd, 1972, exactly 70 days after the crash. Chilean Air Force helicopters, guided by Parado himself, who rode along to point out the location, reached the remaining survivors. 16 men were pulled off that glacier. They had defeated altitude sickness, severe dehydration, horrific injuries, malnutrition, and odds that were basically mathematically impossible. So all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative question. What are the absolute limits of human endurance when you are stripped of everything but the sheer will to live? Flight 571, the miracle of the Andes, forces us to realize that when faced with the absolute impossible, human patience, ingenuity, and that deep determination to survive can push us far beyond anything we could ever imagine. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.